In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the female reproductive system. Principal organs of the female reproductive system are going to be the ovaries, the uterine tubes, which are also called fallopian tubes. They're also called oviducts, but fallopian tubes are probably the more common term for these. Yeah, the newer books are calling them uterine tubes or oviducts. Next we have the uterus and the vagina. And for support and stabilization of the uterus, the ovaries, the uterine tubes, and the uterus is enclosed within what's called the broad ligament, as you can see here. And the mesovarium is going to support and stabilize the ovaries, and here's the mesovarian. And the ovaries are held in position by the ovarian and suspensory ligaments. The blood vessels are going to enter the hilum of the ovaries. And we also have a tunica albuginea that covers each of the ovaries. And oogenesis. Oogenesis is ovum production, so egg production. It's going to occur monthly in the ovarian follicles, and it's part of the ovarian cycle, which contains the follicular phase, which is pre-ovulatory, and luteal phase, which is post-ovulatory. Now, ovulation is going to be the release of that egg after maturation. And probably the best way to take a look at how the egg is produced is we're going to take a look at a little video.
A primordial follicle consists of an oocyte surrounded by a single layer of squamous granulosa cells. A primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle as the granulosa cells become enlarged and cuboidal. The primary follicle enlarges, and the granulosa cells form more than one layer. The zona pellucida forms around the oocyte. The structure is called a secondary follicle when fluid-filled vesicles develop among the granulosa cells and a well-developed capsule, or theca, becomes apparent around the granulosa cells. The theca possesses internal and external layers. The structure is called a mature follicle when the fluid-filled vesicles form a single antrum. At full maturity, the oocyte is located in the cumulus mass. During ovulation, the oocyte is released from the follicle, along with some surrounding granulosa cells of the cumulus mass, called the corona radiata. Following ovulation, the granulosa cells divide rapidly and enlarge to form the yellow corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum degenerates, it forms the white corpus albicans.
And now let's take a look at the ovarian cycle. Okay, again, steps in the ovarian cycle are going to be formation of the primary, secondary, and tertiary follicles, like you saw in the video. And here is a primordial follicle in an egg nest. And then step one, it's going to turn into a primary follicle. And you can see the zona pellucida, as well as the granulosa cells. And that will turn into a secondary follicle. Again, here's the zona pellucida. Here's the nucleus of the primary oocyte and the granulosa cells. And then finally, a tertiary follicle. Here's that antrum containing follicular fluid. Again, granulosal cells and the primary oocyte. And then here we have ovulation, where the secondary oocyte within the corona radiata, along with some follicular fluid, has ruptured from the ovary. And you can see it here. So Again, here's the release of the secondary oocyte with the corona radiata. And then this follicle then is going to become the corpus luteum. Now, if this egg gets fertilized, that corpus luteum will remain and secrete progesterone. If the egg is not fertilized, the egg will die off, and then the corpus luteum will degrade and shrink down to become the corpus albicans. Okay, looking at the uterine tubes, also, as I mentioned, the fallopian tubes or oviducts, it's all the same thing. It just depends on which book you look at. Again, fallopian tube, I think, is still a pretty common term for that. But anyway, here we have the fimbriae, which are the finger-like projections. Okay, we have the infundibulum, for which the fimbriae is connected to. And this area is going to be the one that's closest to the ovary. Then you have the ampulla, which is the middle portion. And then the isthmus is a short tube that connects the fallopian tube to the uterine wall. Now, each uterine tube is going to open up directly into the uterine cavity, as you can see in this picture. And fertilization takes place in the uterine tube. Okay, if sperm has made its way up through the uterus and made its way into the uterine tube or fallopian tube, then ovulation can occur within 24 hours after ovulation while that egg is passing from the infundibulum to the uterus. Now, if something happens and that egg gets fertilized and doesn't make it to the uterus, we call that an ectopic pregnancy. Ectopic pregnancy. Now, the uterus itself is a muscular organ. It provides mechanical protection for the developing fetus. It gives nutritional support, and waste is removed from the developing embryo and the fetus. And it's going to be supported by the broad ligament and 3 pairs of suspensory ligaments. And you can see the broad ligament right here. And then those 3 pairs of suspensory ligaments are going to be the round ligament. Okay. The cardinal ligament. You can see it here as well. And then the uterosacral ligament. And some major anatomical landmarks. We have the body, which is the main portion of the uterus. The isthmus, which is a connection between the body and the cervix. So it's pretty much in this area right here. We have the cervix. And then right here we have the cervical os, or external orifice. We have the cervical canal. And the internal os, or internal orifice. And that leads into the uterine cavity. Now, the uterus, the uterine cavity, I should say, is going to be made up of 3 layers. You have the endometrium, which of course endo means inside, so that's the innermost layer. It's a thin inner glandular mucosa, and this is the area that is going to hormonally, through hormonal secretion, going to build up and then break down and shed during a menstrual cycle. The next layer is going to be the myometrium. Okay, myometrium, myo means muscle, and that's going to be the muscular layer. The next layer is going to be the periometrium, and it's an incomplete serosa that's going to be continuous with the peritoneum. Looking at the blood supply, And again, let's look at those layers. This is going to be the endometrium. Here's your myometrium. Here's your perimetrium. We have the uterine artery, which gives off branches into the myometrium, connects up with these arcuate arteries. They give rise to these radial arteries, and eventually spiral arteries are created as the endometrium begins to build. And this is what the uterus is going to look like if we're looking in a cadaver. We could get a reference from this photo here. So if we're looking down into the cavity, we've got the sigmoid colon, which is going to be behind the uterus. It's going to go behind. Again, here's the uterus. Here's our uterosacral ligaments. Here's our lateral or cardinal ligaments. And then here's the round ligaments holding it in place. In the uterus, we have right here the ovarian ligament, the ovary, and the fallopian tube or uterine tube. Okay, and looking at kind of an overview of the main structures. Again, we have the uterus, we have the fallopian tubes, we have the ovaries, we have the vaginal canal, parts of the uterus, we have the cervix, the cervical os or external os, we have the cervical canal, we have the internal os, and then we have the uterine cavity. The layers of the uterus are going to be the endometrium. We have the myometrium, which is the thickest area here, and then the perimetrium. Parts are going to be the body is the main portion of the uterus. The isthmus connects the body with the cervix. Here we have an ovarian ligament attaching the ovary. And the fallopian tube, the parts, we have the fimbriae, which are the finger-like projections. We have the ampulla. And then we have the isthmus. And a couple of ligaments here. We have the round ligament, and the broad ligament is shown in this particular picture. In here we'll take a look at the uterine cycle, and this is a repeating series of changes in the endometrium, where basically the endometrium is going to build up and then break down again. And that's going to continue from menarche all the way to menopause. And so the menses, you're going to see that degradation of the endometrium. You have a couple of main layers of the endometrium. You're going to have the basilar zone, and that does not break down. This is where the cells are going to be coming from that are going to enlarge the other layer, which is the functional zone. So we have the basilar zone and then the functional zone. And so then we have the proliferative phase, and down here again is the basilar zone, and these cells are going to proliferate and start building this functional zone of the endometrium. And you can see a lot of glands forming. Okay, so there's restoration of the endometrium here. And then we get to the secretory phase, and we have a lot of endometrial glands that enlarge and accelerate their rates of secretion. And if an egg is not fertilized, then we start all over again with menses. Menstruation takes place, the functional layer is shed, and it's going to be rebuilt again in the proliferative phase. Okay, the vagina is going to be the passageway for elimination of the menstrual fluids. It's going to receive the penis during sexual intercourse, and it forms the inferior portion of the birth canal. And you can see here that it's going to be made up of stratified squamous epithelium, non-cornified. Remember, the skin is cornified stratus squamous epithelium, The top layers are pretty much dead, sloughing off cells. These are non-keratinized, so the surface cells are going to be living cells. There's going to be blood vessels. We've got the lamina propria here. And then we're going to have bundles of smooth muscle fibers as well. External genitalia, we have the vestibule, we have the labia minora and labia majora. And the periurethral glands are not showing up in this particular slide. We have the clitoris, and then we have the lesser and greater vestibular glands, which again are not showing up in this particular slide. The mammary glands, we're going to have a pectoral fat pad, and the nipple is going to be surrounded by the areola. Functions of lactation under the control of reproductive hormones. Basically, we have, again, the areola, the nipple. We have the lactiferous sinus. Okay. We have the lactiferous duct. And then we have the lobes of the mammary gland, as well as we have suspensory ligaments. Now, hormones of the female reproductive system, they're going to control reproductive cycle, and they're going to coordinate the ovarian and uterine cycles. And the key hormones are going to be FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. It's going to cause development of the follicle and allow the egg to mature. LH is luteinizing hormone, and that maintains the structure and secretory function of the corpus luteum. Remember, I said that the corpus luteum, if the egg is fertilized, it's going to produce progesterone. Well, luteinizing hormone has an effect on the corpus luteum and allows it to maintain its structure in order to produce that progesterone. Estrogens have multiple functions, and progesterones, if you just take that word progestation, it's going to stimulate endometrial growth and secretions, which are going to make the endometrium ready for the egg to implant if it has been fertilized. Okay, taking a look here. Okay, we're going to look at the follicle as it develops, releases the egg, and what happens to the corpus luteum. So in this area here, just before ovulation, we have the follicular phase. Okay, and so in the follicular phase, what's happening up in the hypothalamus of the brain? Okay, it is going to release gonadal-releasing hormone down to the anterior pituitary. Okay, so gonadal-releasing hormone. And then the anterior pituitary is going to produce and release gonadotropic hormones. So one of those is FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. So if you notice during the follicular phase, FSH is going to cause this follicle to mature. And luteinizing hormone is going to be relatively low. Now, when the follicle matures, we're going to have what's called an LH surge, luteinizing hormone surge. That is going to stimulate the follicle to then, or the egg, I should say, to rupture from the follicle. And so this is ovulation. Now we enter the luteal phase. And if you notice, gonadotropic releasing hormone has spiked, which has caused a spike in this LH. Okay. Little spike in FSH. but then both of these are going to drop down, okay, during the luteal phase. And you can see that gonadotropic releasing hormone is going to drop as well. Because, like I said, the corpus luteum, if the egg is fertilized, the corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone. If not, then it's going to start to shrink down and then become the corpus albicans. Okay, looking at the uterine cycle here, starting at menstruation. Okay, so there's destruction of the functional zone of the endometrium. And here you can see the level of estrogen. As estrogen increases, it's going to spur on the proliferative phase. And this is where there's repair and regeneration of the functional zone. Okay, and right about the time it peaks, we then enter the secretory zone. And so if you take a look at inhibin is going to pretty much spike at the proliferative phase. And what inhibin does is it's going to inhibit the production and release of follicle stimulating hormone in the pituitary gland. It also reduces the hypothalamic luteinizing hormone release hormone that, again, is going to be found in the hypothalamus. And so we're going to decrease basically luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone at this point. And then there's going to be ovulation, and again, this is going to start to build. So the endometrium builds in the secretory phase, and again, this is going to be spurred on by increasing progesterone. Okay, if you notice, estrogens kind of drop back down again. Inhibin spikes because, again, we want to inhibit follicle stimulating hormone, because right now we're waiting to see if that egg that was released is going to be fertilized. If it is, then it's going to be implanted. Okay, and if not, then this is going to start all over again, and we go back to menses, where the endometrium breaks down, proliferative phase, endometrium starts to build back up, secretory phase, it's ready for implantation of that fertilized egg. Menopause. This is the time that ovulation and menstruation ceases. And it's typically around age 45 to 55. And it's accompanied by a decline in circulating estrogen and progesterone. And there's a rise in gonadotropic releasing hormone, FSH and LH.